Welcome to Happy Planet, an impact economy podcast where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, and thought leaders pursuing both profit and planetary health. I'm your host, Abigail Carroll. Our first season will treat the ocean economy, where some of the greatest environmental impacts are being forged from business innovation. Today, I'll introduce you to Nicholas Sullivan. I discovered Nico through his book, Blue Revolution, Hunting, Harvesting, and Fishing. In it, he breaks down commonly held myths about both wild catch and aquaculture. I was interested in talking to him about how business innovation and good policy are ushering in a new post-industrial era of increasingly sustainable and traceable quality seafood. What really struck me from this conversation was how optimistic he remains about the future of fish. Welcome to the podcast, Nico.
Thank you. It's a treat to be here on this new podcast.
First, I'd just love to know more about you and how you got interested in the blue economy.
Well, I am a writer, and I have long focused on, the impact of technology and entrepreneurship on business and social innovation. As I progressed through my career, I've gotten more and more interested in international work, going from the U.S. to the international. And in the course of the international work, of course, food security kept coming up over and over again, and fish is a huge part of, food security, especially in the developing world, where, a majority of people get the majority of their protein from fish. And I, of course, had heard all the dire stories that many have heard about, the depletion of fish stocks. And so I just started to wonder where the fish are going to come from to feed the world. And I'll say one more thing about my interest in the fishing is that I had written about fishing some decades ago when the Magnuson-Stevens Act was being first put into law in 1976 to establish the 200-mile limit to push the Russian and other European factory ships off our shores, and to establish all the kind of principles that the U.S. has been, managing its fisheries by ever since. So I kind of came back.
That's interesting. And I want to definitely get back to the Magnuson-Stevens Act a little bit later in the podcast. So you have this emerging markets background. Fisheries are sort of a hot topic now. You're interested in technology and food. We're all talking today about by 2050, we're going to have to double the world's food production to feed the world's population. Certainly in the fisheries world, we believe that fish are going to be a big part of that. You get into that here in your new book, The Blue Revolution. What do you mean by the Blue Revolution?
The Blue Revolution has a very specific meaning, but I have expanded it. So initially, the Blue Revolution referred to, there was a green revolution in the 50s, 60s, 70s to expand rice and wheat yield in Mexico and Asia. Very successful in many ways. And then in the 1980s, there was an explosion of aquaculture, freshwater aquaculture in India and other parts of Asia that became referred to as the Blue Revolution. So both were focused on food production, rice and wheat. Supposedly the Green Revolution kept 1 billion people from starvation. And then the Blue Revolution, of course, same thing, how to feed the world. But it was freshwater aquaculture. So my Blue Revolution is kind of an extension of that, saying it's marine aquaculture as well. It's Western, it's the entire world. It's not just India or Asia. And it's not just food production, but it's, ocean habitat restoration, preservation, and so forth.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Green Revolution was basically prompted by Americans bringing farming technology and know-how to Asia and Mexico. But the Blue Revolution, interestingly, the aquaculture happening in India and Asia were not based on U.S. technology. They've been ahead of us. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yep. And aquaculture has been going on for thousands of years. But it's only really since the 80s and 90s that it has been it's been negligible on the global scale. But in the 80s and 90s being when kind of, wild capture fisheries hit a kind of flat line, and they've been flat ever since. And then, aquaculture has just been, the graph has been going up to the right. So yes, everything you say is true. It's primarily freshwater aquaculture still in the world. The marine is new, and it was definitely an Asian phenomenon for centuries, and some South America as well.
Yes, right. In Chile and such. Okay, we've got this blue revolution, and why is it so important right now? Why is this book important?
I start again with the food because the world population has been growing 1.6% per year for the last 60 years. Fish consumption per capita has been growing 3% per year over that time. So fish consumption has been doubling world population growth. It's important because the world is going to continue to grow and we need more food. There's a demand for seafood. It's a lean protein. Seafood production is much more ecologically sound than, say, beef or pig production on land, which takes up a lot of land, a lot of water, a lot of grain. So it's a much more efficient food to produce. In terms of the ocean itself, 70% of the planet is ocean. And many people always say that planet Earth should really be called planet ocean. So the protection of and restoration of the ocean is really important. And I think that's a big part of this. So 50 to 80% of the oxygen we breathe comes from algae, microalgae, or phytoplankton in the ocean. Phytoplankton with warming waters and climate change is a bit under duress in terms of its production. So there are a lot of reasons to care and engage with the Blue Revolution, to continue it and to expand it and to develop businesses around it.
Right, because we're really talking about feeding the planet in an environmentally sustainable way and at once exploiting the resources of the ocean and the opportunities of the ocean, but also restoring it while we do that.
One of the drivers, of course, of the Blue Revolution is, what it started with, which is aquaculture, in which, by the way, now 52% of the seafood eaten in the world is farmed. At least that was the last United Nations number I saw. And it's so different than wild capture fishing, which is basically hunting, right? So it's a different thing. It's more science oriented, it's more entrepreneurial, and it's a different game, really, than wild capture fishing. And so that's one of the drivers. And the technology, which has, been accelerating in the last 30, 40 years, is a key part of it too, making it more and more possible in terms of AI and sensors and data collection and machine learning.
Yeah,
And it's made fish farming much more efficient and profitable.
right. Can you talk to me a little bit? I feel like there's a lot of sort of misconceptions in the whole world of fish today. We've got wild fisheries, and there's a sense that on the one hand, we're depleting our fisheries. On the other hand, we've got fishermen who are suffering because there's so many rules, it's very hard to keep up. And, on the aquaculture side, I feel like there's a lot of mystery about, is this a sustainable practice? Is this not a sustainable practice? Can we break some of that down?
As I started getting into this and talking to people, I realized that most people, wherever they live or however close to the coast or not they are, do have a lot of negative perceptions of fishing, wild capture, and fish farming. And I was seeing a different story, a different picture. And I think that a lot of the negative perceptions date back to the 90s, which is when the overfishing really peaked, when the cod really kind of dropped off the edge of a cliff in terms of stock size, when the messy Norwegian salmon farms were near shore with sea lice and escapement and all these things that led people to say, and there were T-shirts and posters, a lot coming out of Alaska, I think, saying, "Friends don't let friends eat farmed fish." Robert Jones, the head of aquaculture at the Nature Conservancy, used to be one of those people, but now he's head of aquaculture at the Nature Conservancy. So that's a simple example of how people's perceptions have changed and should change, I think.
So why should we be looking at aquaculture differently today? What are some of the things that are happening that are making it more palatable and more sustainable and just a better choice for people?
Well, one thing that I've learned, actually, I learned this from the Nature Conservancy, is that the majority of marine aquaculture or mariculture is shellfish and kelp. And of course, the
Yeah.
negative perceptions that most people have are based on finfish farming in
Yeah.
nearshore waters. So, shellfish and kelp are both naturally restorative to the water as they don't use food. They're very, it's a very efficient to grow. As you know, as an
Yes.
oyster farmer,
We had no bad perceptions. It was great.
no. And they're high protein and all that stuff. I mean, it is hard to imagine feeding the world on oysters and mussels and kelp,
Yeah.
but
Right.
that's a different issue. And the other thing is that the whole, aquaculture processes have switched. I mean, people are going further and further offshore into deeper waters with stronger currents, so keeping the water clean, or they're going to land-based recirculating tanks, which solves a lot of the ocean environmental problems. I know that they're controversial in some places because of just of the lingering perceptions, but I think it's a much cleaner business. It's recirculating water and cleaning it, and and there's very little waste. The only issue with those big tanks is that they're expensive to run, a lot of electricity, a lot of water, and a lot of possibility for error. I mean, if the systems go out, you can lose a lot of fish fast.
For
And
sure. For sure.
the other misperception that I didn't get to on the wild side is that people really think that fish are just disappearing, that they're all going extinct, or a lot of them are. And the fact of the matter is that there have been almost very few marine extinctions in the last 500 years. It is true that one third, the UN says one third of fish stocks are overfished, but that doesn't mean they're extinct. It means if we continue overfishing them, they could become extinct. And the other thing about that the overfishing is that one third of the fish that are caught illegally. And I think that's a huge part of the overfishing that we are talking about. It's these pirate ships, it's nations like Korea, China, Thailand, Japan, Spain that are fishing in other people's waters without regard for, sustainable limits or, controls at all. But it's a fairly concrete, discrete number of actors that are doing that, and there's a lot of emphasis on identifying and targeting them. So it's not like all fishermen are bad. It's like there's just some countries that are out of control, and some kind of pirate operations. That is a big perception issue, and I think that then people should say, well, actually, especially in the U.S., which is a very well managed fishery, right, and is considered a model for the world, that there is a way to do it right. And a lot of countries, I'd say half or more of the world's population actually is fishing, within sustainable limits and managing their fisheries very well.
It's always the few bad actors that ruin it for everybody, right?
I really think, I really became to see that as the issue of the few bad actors who are causing a lot of problems.
It just getting sort of a little deeper into the wild fisheries. What were some of the biggest surprises to you as you were digging into the wild fisheries?
Well, it's two things. One is I started out looking at the global issue, but I was really focused on New England Northeast, where I grew up. And if you look at the value of landings, lobster is number one on the East Coast, scallops is number two, and aquaculture is number three. And groundfish, which are the iconic cod and haddock and everything, are less than 10% of landings or value of landings. So that's one thing. The other is that there are more groundfish in New England and the Northeast now than there were 20 or 30 years ago because of new management techniques. So that was a surprise to me. So what else? The other thing is, fish are, with climate change, they're moving around. As you probably have heard, and lobsters are moving north, black sea bass moving from the mid-Atlantic, and squid moving from the mid-Atlantic up to the northeast, Gulf of Maine. And so there's a lot of that going on. And the other thing is that I say in this book several times that the last 20 years have been better for the fish than the fishermen, because I think some of the policies that have been enacted to manage the fisheries, which they have done a good job at doing, have been bad for the fishermen, because there's been a lot of consolidation of fleets. A lot of boats have been lost. A lot of captains have gone out of business. And it's very hard for young people to get into the business because it's expensive and you need to buy the quota.
Right. I think in New Bedford, I think a quota for a scallop boat is like $3 million or something like that. Very, or the license for a scallop boat for a season.
I can believe it. Yeah.
Aquaculture, I guess, is meant to solve some of these problems, right?
One problem is it would take pressure off the need to catch wild fish,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or it would allow us and other countries to continue fishing at a sustainable level without going crazy. The U.S. is very far behind in all this. As you mentioned earlier, aquaculture started in Asia, it's been there for thousands of years. The U.S. is 18th in the world now in aquaculture, and even though we have second most ocean territory in the world after France, and we have a huge seafood trade deficit, $17 billion. So if we keep going on this, if aquaculture, and it is the fastest form of food production in the world, and marine aquaculture is the fastest growing form of aquaculture, and we're 18th in the world, our trade deficit is going to keep increasing unless we make some radical shift. And that then becomes a kind of a issue of national security, really. I mean, food security is a big issue.
For sure.
And of course, for the Commerce Department, the trade deficit is a huge issue. Yeah, we could afford to ramp up our aquaculture.
Right. It's a climate issue too. I think the statistic is somewhere between 70 and 85 or 90% of our seafood is imported. And so the carbon footprint on our seafood is something of a global catastrophe.
Oh, I know all the salmon being flown in, right? Well, as you know, in Maine, there are 3 new salmon farms that have been permitted, I believe, right in
Yep.
Belfast, Bucksport, Millinocket, and they're all land-based, and they're near to markets. There's a huge salmon farm in South Miami. There's one in Indiana. There's one in Wisconsin. There's one going in Nevada, California, I think. So there's a big push to move, and the U.S. is the number 1 importer of salmon. So there is a big carbon footprint issue there. Consumers are a big part of this. I came to realize as I was working on this that the consumers have a huge opportunity to demand different foods, different quality of fish, different farming techniques, and different types of fish.
Yeah.
Because salmon is a carnivorous fish, takes 3 years to grow out, and so that's a big economic investment. And there are other fish that are faster and easier to grow and that are equally high protein and tasty, and branzino and barramundi to come to mind, among others.
It's funny because even in land farming, if you read menus from like 200 years ago, they were eating like muskrat and like possum and all these different things. And then we decided to farm, so they pick some key sort of animals to farm. And then you've got the seafood. You would think, because so much of seafood has historically been wild catch, that we would have continued to eat more variety of fish, and yet we've been very reductive in what we eat.
Right. You talked about the imports. So the majority of the seafood Americans eat is farmed salmon and farmed shrimp from the other side of the world, either Asia, Norway, or Chile, and also canned tuna from the other side of the world. That's like 65% of the seafood that Americans eat. That has got to switch. And this black sea bass is becoming very popular. Dogfish, unfortunately, are not very popular, but they're very abundant. But people have to switch to move to what the Gulf of Maine Research Institute identified as underutilized or unloved species, and start eating what the ocean provides to make it more supply-based rather than demand-based.
We'll be right back after a short break. Today's sponsor is Blue Trace. Blue Trace offers the easiest and most powerful traceability solution for shellfish harvesters, growers, distributors, and dealers. Their tagging and distributor apps enable organizations big and small to optimize their activities, comply with regulations, and keep up with their inventory. For more information about Blue Trace, visit their website, blue-trace.com. Welcome back to Happy Planet. So we want to start using more underutilized fish, but you also talk about what the example the Icelandic people are providing with 100% utilization. So can you talk to us a little bit about the ocean cluster in Iceland and what they're doing?
The Iceland Ocean Cluster is definitely a world model. Started about 2010 or 11, I believe. Thor Sigfusson. It's basically a big incubator on the docks in Reykjavik. They're not fishing businesses, but they're marine-related businesses trying to make use of all parts of the fish. And 100% utilization is one of the goals of the cluster, right? Because usually, in most cases, 40 to 50% of fish are just thrown overboard or turned into pet food, which is not a high value thing. So they've got all these businesses going there that are producing, pharmaceuticals and health aids and bandages. The famous one that to me is that Kerasis bandage for diabetic wounds that is using cod skin. So you can get 8 bandages from one cod that are worth 500 each or $4,000 for the skin of one cod. But the other interesting thing about the ocean cluster in Iceland is that Thor, the founder of it, has become an evangelist, to use an old Silicon Valley term, for the idea of, on the dock blue economy incubators. And there's one in Portland, Maine now, there's one in New Bedford, Mass, there's one in New Haven, Connecticut, Seattle, Washington, Sitka, Alaska, or Anchorage, Alaska. I think there's one in Norway. So there's a global movement, and they're all different. They're all kind of locally driven, depending on the type of entrepreneur, so the type of product. But it's a very positive, and there's a lot of interaction between all these clusters. Idea sharing, which is why Thor started the Ocean Cluster initially. Was he said he has a PhD in networking, and he said and fishing is one of the top industries in Iceland. He said, I always, it was unbelievable to me that the fishermen didn't talk to each other. Fishing businesses didn't talk to other fishing businesses. They're also isolated and secretive. And so he's tried to bust that apart.
From a casual observation of the Portland Ocean Cluster, I've been impressed at collaborative and multidisciplinary approach of what's going on there. I mean, I have a friend who's a law professor who has a spot there. I have a friend who's innovated, actually, who's going to be on our podcast, who's innovated sort of alternative to bottom paint. There's the skincare people in there. It's a really interesting mix of people that are very collaborative and not competitive, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, and then there are other groups like See Ahead, which I know out of Boston and Providence, and now Mississippi, which is not an ocean cluster on the docks, but it's an international cluster of businesses in the blue economy that are working all over the place that have this core and are getting introduced to each other and to investors and so forth, because investment in fishing itself has been people have never invested in fishing. The only people would be fishermen who hit it big and would reinvest in their own business, but outside investors. So that's another positive development.
Well, I think that speaks to our audience here, and where we're trying to go with this podcast is really to look at the blue economy and look at some of these issues like seafood.
But the other thing related to all that is not just utilizing 100% of the fish, which is a goal. I don't think anyone's really done 100%, or maybe they have in some cases, but of getting more value for the fish. Like True Fin in Maine has been doing that with the Kejime technique of quick kill and so forth. And some of the Hudson Valley farms in New York State, which is farming steelhead, is using a version of that Open blue cobia in Panama is also doing that kind of quick stun kill thing. It preserves the freshness and value of the fish so you can charge more for it. And also with flash freezing techniques today, right? You can get fish and start the processing on board, ideally, which is happening in Iceland, and do the flash freeze, and you've just got a really fresh fish because, in the past, people used to equate quality with freshness, and frozen was seen as kind of a third-rate commodity kind of supermarket food. But that game has changed a lot.
Yep. I mean, this idea of fresh is also a bit fuzzy because so much of fish even is just frozen on the boat before it gets to shore. I mean, just thrown on ice. So, but I'm not even talking about fresh, flash frozens. It's a fuzzy issue to begin with. So
Right, right.
it does make a lot of sense to embrace technologically advanced freezing techniques and preserve the fish as close to its source as possible.
Yeah, and of course, some of the fish that is frozen, you talk about the imports and exports. That I mean, we basically export what we catch and import what we eat. But a lot of the fish we export is frozen, shipped overseas for processing, refrozen, and shipped back. So it's twice frozen, which you talk about the carbon footprint, but also it's kind of a sorry piece of fish after it's been frozen, thawed. So there's a lot to fix. Put it that way.
What are some of the things that the technologies that you've learned about through writing this book that make you excited and that you think are part of the solution?
This whole movement toward QR codes for two purposes is really exciting. I mean, Red's Best in Boston is one of the first that I know of that did it using QR codes for storytelling. Just the name of the boat, the name of the captain, the gear, the locale, and everything. And that's another kind of connection between producer and consumers. And then taking that another level is like Legit Fish in Boston, which is now developing blockchain traceability for New Bedford and Gloucester auctions. That takes on more importance when you think about the pirated illegal fish that is caught and then imported to the U.S. using that traceability or the new DNA testing, quick probe DNA test to identify the type of fish and where it comes from. All those things, I think, increase the value of the fish.
And the FDA is going to demand that soon. I mean, there's new rules coming up this fall that are going to ask for traceability basically from tide to table.
Let's hope that mentioned the developing world initially, where the importance of fish to the diet there. The artisanal and indigenous fishermen in, say, the west coast of Africa are getting totally hammered by this illegal fishing, by these foreign fleets coming into African waters, and they cannot compete. So that, along with the illegal fishing, that protection of indigenous artisanal fisheries, and, in the Western Pacific as well, is a really important thing. And I think the Western Pacific islands there's a lot of really good regional cooperative units that are protecting those fisheries.
Yeah. So, despite all of this confusion in your book, I got the sense that you were pretty optimistic.
Well, yeah, I am optimistic. There's a lot of positive stuff like that going on. The science and technology making farming more efficient and ecological. One thing I really like is this idea of in aquaculture of aquaponics, which is using water from that the fish have grown in to clean that water and then use it to grow vegetables. And one other thing I really am excited about is the idea of these marine protected areas. There's a goal to get 30% of the ocean protected by 2030, which is not going to happen. But I think that it is growing. It's 7% now is protected. So say it gets to 20%. But I think that's really good for the ability of fish to adapt to climate change, because if they don't have to worry about being hunted, they can worry about adapting to the changes in their ocean.
What kind of advice would you give to entrepreneurs who are interested in the blue revolution? What are some of the things that what are some of the nuts that need to be cracked?
Well, one thing that would be interesting is electric boats. Investment in marine related businesses that are not necessarily fish itself, but in the utilization of in new product development is really big. And I know you believe that as well.
I do.
In a world where we are looking to the ocean to help us feed a growing planet, Nico's research and writing helps clarify the challenges and opportunities of fishing and aquaculture. Unlike the Green Revolution, where the U.S. was exporting technology abroad, in Nico's Blue Revolution, we have a lot to learn from innovations in Iceland, Norway, and China, to name a few. Despite all of these challenges, I was so happy to hear Nico's optimism about the power of innovation to provide seafood that is healthy for us and for the planet. Thank you for listening. Please follow the Happy Planet podcast wherever you listen and leave us a rating and review. It really does help new listeners discover the show. Happy Planet was reported and hosted by me, Abigail Carroll. I am the executive producer. The talented Dylan Hoyer is our producer and editor. Our theme music was created by composer George Brandel Egloff. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetcapital.com.